In the winter of 1884, the wind sliced across the Nebraska prairie with a sharper bite than usual. When Callum McKay first started digging a trench beside his half-built cabin, the neighbors slowed their wagons just to stare. Men who had split firewood their whole lives squinted at the sight of him lowering bricks and stovepipe into a pit. Women whispered that he must have misunderstood the stove manual. Children sat on the fence rails and giggled. "Burying a chimney?" Old Bramley said, spitting a stream of tobacco. "That fool's gonna smoke himself out before the first frost." But Callum kept digging. The year was 1887, and the valley where he lived had just survived the kind of winter that made men reconsider every choice they'd made since birth. Frost had crept under every door. Chimney drafts had reversed into living rooms. Wood piles had shrunk faster than anyone believed possible. Several cabins nearly caught fire when men threw in logs too fast, desperate to fight the cold. It wasn't just discomfort, it was dangerous. Callum had watched his wife Ada sit near the stove, with their baby wrapped tightly in her arms, her breath fogging the air, despite the flames dancing not 3 feet away. Their cabin, well built by every frontier standard, still lost heat faster than they could generate it. The chimney seemed to suck warmth out of the room instead of holding it. That winter humbled every man in the valley. For Callum, it also planted an idea. He knew something about heat that most of his neighbors didn't. Before settling on the prairie, he had worked in an ironworks in Pennsylvania, shaping stovepipe elbows and draft collars. He'd seen heat behave in strange ways, moving sideways, sinking low, lingering in stone long after the fire had died. He knew how easily heat could be stolen by cold air rushing through a tall, exposed flue. And he remembered something else, a story his Scottish grandfather once told him about an old stone cottage with a flue that ran through the floor rather than the roof. It wasted nothing. Every inch of stone it touched warmed and radiated heat back into the room. It was a strange memory, but it lit a fuse in his mind. What if the chimney didn't have to be tall? What if it could run below the fire instead of above it? What if the earth itself could capture warmth and release it slowly over time? The idea came quietly at first, then fully formed. Callum pictured a fire heating the air inside the stove, that heat traveling into a horizontal flue buried under packed soil, the earth absorbing excess warmth like a giant thermal battery. The colder the sky grew, the more the buried chimney would resist losing heat, and the longer the earth held that warmth, the longer the cabin would stay livable, even after the fire went out. It was ridiculous to everyone else. To Callum, it felt like the only sane thing he could do. So, in the late summer sun, with grasshoppers rattling through the tall weeds and neighbors shaking their heads, he dug a channel nearly 20 feet long and 3 feet deep. He lined the bottom with flat stones, notched each brick carefully, and placed stovepipe sections end to end, sealing gaps with clay and ash. Then he buried the whole system, leaving only the stove's firebox and a small exit vent above the ground. He wasn't finished. A system like this needed help to breathe, so he carved a narrow air passage near the back of the stove to draw fresh oxygen from outside, something most frontier stoves never had. Finally, he built the stove around the buried flue, a squat, tight-mouthed iron box built for slow, controlled burns. When he lit the first fire, his hands shook. He fed thin slivers of pine, then thicker sticks of cottonwood. The stove glowed a calm, deep orange. No smoke poured back into the room. No draft howled down the flue. And the cabin grew warm, truly warm, faster than it ever had before. But the real test wasn't comfort. It was endurance. Callum let the fire burn down until only embers remained. Hours later, the stove cooled, but the floor radiated heat as if someone had hidden a second fire beneath it. He knelt and pressed his palm flat. The soil was warm. He had done something unheard of on the frontier. He made the earth part of the stove. Word spread faster than he expected. First as gossip, then ridicule, then concern. "That's not a chimney, it's a grave for smoke. He'll burn his cabin down. Mark my words, a buried flue will choke you to death." But Callum ignored all of it, because winter was coming, and he believed his strange chimney would give him something no one else had, a fire that worked with the cold instead of losing to it. And though no one knew it yet, the winter ahead would be the one that proved every man right, or proved Callum right, in a way none of them could deny. The settlers in the valley trusted one thing above all else: the iron stove. Heavy, black, stubborn, and hungry, it had become the symbol of frontier survival. If a man had a good stove, a sharp axe, and enough wood, he believed he could withstand anything winter threw at him. But in the winter of '87, the iron stoves of the valley proved how fragile that faith really was. Most cabins had tall chimneys, long, straight columns of brick, or stacked stone that reached high above the roofline. Builders insisted a tall chimney was the key to strong draft. More height meant more pull, and more pull meant more heat. Except that wasn't how it worked in the practice. Callum had seen the truth years earlier in the ironworks. He remembered watching a master smith tap a red-hot iron plate with his hammer and explain to the new apprentices, heat doesn't just rise, it travels anywhere. Cold invites it. He hadn't fully understood the lesson then. Out here, he understood it with painful clarity. A tall chimney didn't just draw smoke upward, it drew heat upward. And not politely, it ripped it out. The moment you opened the stove door, the draft acted like a liquid being sucked through a straw. Warm room air raced into the stove, bled into the flue, and vanished out the top. Meanwhile, cold air rushed in through cracks in the walls and floorboards to replace it. The taller the chimney, the worse the effect. But the real flaw wasn't the stove. It was the physics the valley didn't understand. Callum had studied those failures every evening after supper, kneeling by his stove, running his fingers along the stovepipe, watching how heat moved. He saw how the iron glowed at the base, but cooled quickly, a few feet up. He noticed how the outside walls of the pipe felt warm for only a short section before losing all their heat to the cold air around them. Then he remembered something from stories of the old country. In Scotland, his grandfather had once lived in a stone cottage built into the hillside. Instead of a tall chimney, a horizontal stone channel led the exhaust beneath the floor before it rose into a thin vent stack outside. The fire heated the stones first, and the stones heated the house. The idea never left him. On the prairie, he also heard stories about indigenous lodges, structures built partly underground with flues carved into earth mounds that trapped heat in the soil. Some had central fires, whose warmth radiated through packed clay long after the flames went out. Different places, different cultures, but the principle was the same. Earth remembers heat longer than air. Callum began sketching ideas in charcoal along the inside of empty flour sacks. He drew a tall chimney and marked where the heat vanished. He drew a short chimney, half buried, and circled the wide area of retained warmth. Then he drew a buried chimney, one that moved heat sideways through dirt, not upward into cold wind. The charcoal lines felt instinctual, almost obvious. Tall chimney, heat escapes. Buried chimney, heat stays. To prove it, he did a series of small tests. He dug shallow trenches in the yard, heated stones, and buried them. Hours later, the stones still radiated warmth through the soil. He burned small amounts of firewood in a makeshift sideways flue made of brick shards, and felt how long the earth above it stayed warm. The valley laughed when they heard he was burying fire underground. Callum didn't mind. He wasn't insulting their ways, he was diagnosing them. He saw 4 major failures in typical chimneys. Failure 1. The draft pulled too hard, sucking warm room air into the fire too quickly and wasting heat and fuel. Failure 2. Heat shot upward and vanished into the sky. Failure 3. Cold air rushed in to replace the lost warmth, chilling the room faster than the stove could warm it. Failure 4. Airflow was violent instead of steady, causing spikes of heat, drops of cold, and wild temperature swings in every cabin. Callum didn't want more heat. He wanted slower heat, heat that rested, lingered, and seeped into the bones of the house. That winter, Callum walked cabin to cabin, quietly asking neighbors about their struggles. How much wood did you go through last week? How cold did the floor get? When did the draft reverse? What cracked first? The stove or the stovepipe? Their answers confirmed everything he suspected. One neighbor's chimney had frozen halfway up, blocking draft entirely. Another family burned half a cord of wood in a single night. Someone else found frost forming inside the stovepipe because the heat was escaping faster than the fire could replace it. When Callum asked if they would consider a shorter chimney, they laughed. You must be out of your mind, Callum. A tall chimney is the only way. He didn't argue. He didn't explain the physics. He didn't tell them about Scottish cottages or Indigenous earth channels. He just nodded. Because he had already decided the only way to prove his idea was to build the buried chimney with his own two hands. As he studied the old chimney systems of Europe, Asia, and the frontier tribes, one thing became painfully clear. People in cold lands had been heating with the ground for thousands of years. People on the prairie had forgotten that wisdom. Callum intended to remember it. And with winter creeping closer each day, the clock was ticking. He needed to build something that would keep his family warm through a cold no ordinary stove could handle. The trench behind Callum McKay's cabin grew deeper by the day. By late August, it had become a long, dark scar in the prairie sod, stretching from the back wall of the house toward a shallow rise in the earth. Anyone passing on foot or wagon could see the stubborn shape forming. To them, it made no sense. A man burying stovepipe was like a man burying his own boots, pointless, foolish, doomed. But to Callum, every shovelful of dirt was a step toward a stove that didn't bleed heat into the sky. He began with the channel itself, a trench 3 feet deep, 20 feet long, wide enough for 2 bricks laid side by side. At the base, he lined the ground with flat stones, hand-picked from a dry creek bed a mile away. Their purpose wasn't beauty but stability. A chimney, even a buried one, needed a foundation that wouldn't buckle during freeze-thaw cycles. On top of the stones, he laid the first row of bricks, each seated carefully in a mix of clay, ash, and sand. He didn't use lime mortar. It cracked too easily in the cold. Clay was flexible. Clay forgave mistakes. Clay expanded and contracted without losing its grip. Neighbors drifted by, offering comments that pretended to be jokes but carried an edge. Chimney goes up, Callum. You know that, right? You planning to heat the worms? At least dig a grave big enough for yourself and the stove both. He smiled through it all. The truth was simple. They couldn't imagine a chimney that didn't climb toward the clouds. The frontier taught them that heat only moved upward, never sideways. They trusted height, not physics. Callum trusted something else: stone, soil, and the steady patience of thermal mass. Once the lower bricks were set, he added 2 more rows, creating a rectangular flue roughly the size of a man's forearm. It wasn't meant to be large. A smaller diameter slowed the exhaust, forcing more heat into the surrounding earth before the smoke emerged at the surface. Over the brick flue, he placed heavy, flat stones to serve as a roof. He sealed the joints with clay so thick it squeezed through his fingers like bread dough. Finally, he covered the entire structure with packed soil, dense, dark, and cold to the touch. The buried chimney was complete, hidden, protected, ready to swallow heat into the ground. But a buried chimney alone couldn't save a home. It needed a powerful heart, so Callum built the stove. He welded a compact firebox from salvaged iron plate, shorter than his neighbor's stoves, but thicker. The iron walls were nearly half an inch thick, allowing them to store heat and release it slowly. The firebox had a small mouth, a narrow throat, and an adjustable draft plate. It wasn't a stove made to blaze. It was a stove made to moldar, a slow, controlled burn that sent heat crawling through the buried flue like a traveling ember. He connected the firebox to the underground chimney with a short horizontal pipe. Then he dug a secondary intake channel from the outside directly into the base of the firebox. This was the part that confused neighbors most. Why would you feed cold air right into the fire? Because fires didn't suffocate when given fresh oxygen. They burned cleaner. Cleaner fires produced hotter coals, perfect for radiant heating. The final part of the build was the riser. the small vent stack at the end of the buried flue. Instead of a tall chimney, Callum used a short clay pipe, no more than 3 feet above the surface. It was capped with a weather hood and protected from wind by a ring of stones. When he stepped back, the whole thing looked wrong. No towering chimney, no pipe stabbing into the sky. Just a stove, a trench of packed earth, and a short vent in the distance. Even Callum felt a flicker of doubt, but he had come too far to question physics. The ground would do what the sky could not. The testing began at dusk. He loaded the stove with cottonwood scraps and set them ablaze. Flames curled upward, licking the iron walls. The fire caught quickly. Too quickly. The stove glowed a sullen orange. Then came the moment of truth. He closed the draft plate slowly. Inch by inch, the fire dimmed. The smoke eased into the horizontal flue. He rested his palm on the packed soil above the buried chimney. Nothing. Minutes passed, still nothing. Then faintly, the ground warmed. It grew warmer, then warmer still, enough for Callum to pull his hand back with a startled hiss. His heart pounded. The earth was absorbing the heat and holding it. The stove burned low and slow, but the warming ground radiated heat upward like a sleeping animal, breathing under the floor. Callum extinguished the fire entirely. An hour passed. Then 2. The floor stayed warm. He sat on a crate, staring at the packed soil, imagining the winter ahead. What would happen when the cold came? Would the buried flue resist the wind? Would the stove draft properly in a blizzard? Would the heat stay trapped underground for hours? Could his system keep his family safe? He couldn't know yet, but he knew one thing. For the first time since the last brutal winter, hope didn't feel dangerous. If stories of forgotten ingenuity speak to you, if you enjoy seeing how ordinary people solved extraordinary problems, consider joining us here on Frontier Tales of America. Your support helps us keep these long-lost frontier skills alive. Winter wasn't far off, and the storm coming that year would test every stove in the valley and every belief the frontier held about heat. Winter did not creep into the valley that year. It arrived like a declaration. On the morning of December 28th, 1887, the sky turned the color of blued steel. The wind went silent in that unnerving way only the prairie understands, like the land itself was holding its breath. Chickens stayed close to the coop. Horses lifted their heads and sniffed the air. Callum felt the shift in his bones. "This one's coming hard," he murmured. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. By sundown, 35. And by the time the first flakes appeared, the wind had begun to roar. The storm slammed into the valley with a violence no one could have predicted. It wasn't the snow that terrified people. It was the speed. Children playing outside at midday were forced indoors by late afternoon when the wind began driving ice shards sideways. Fine snow slipped through nail holes and unchinked cracks. Horses panicked in their stalls. Men sprinted to tie down wagons before they vanished under the emerging drifts. Inside the cabins scattered across the prairie, stoves were pushed to their limits. At the Larson homestead, smoke sputtered back down the chimney, filling the room with a sour haze. The hotter they stoked the fire, the more the draft reversed. Their chimney, tall and proud, was now an icy funnel, dragging cold downward. At the Peterson cabin, flames roared in the stove, but refused to warm the room. The draft raced up the chimney so fast that the stove lost heat faster than the fire could replace it. The children cried beneath quilts as their breath drifted like fog in the lamplight. At the Harlow place, the chimney froze solid halfway up. The rising smoke hit the wall of ice, slowed, and then spilled into the room. They opened the front door once to let the smoke out. A wave of cold air swept in so brutally, it extinguished the embers. Callum's cabin stood in the same storm. But it sounded different. The wind hammered the walls. Snow slapped the windows like thrown handfuls of flour. But inside, the stove burned low and slow, the quiet orange glow of fire reflecting off the iron plates. He checked the buried flue first. He pressed his palm to the ground above the trench. The soil was warm, noticeably warm, despite the cold battering the house. Heat radiated up through the floorboards in a steady, soft pulse. He checked the intake shaft. It pulled cleanly, feeding the fire oxygen without letting wind bully its way inside. He checked the riser vent at the far end of the buried chimney. Through a slit in the shutters, he could see the short cap trembling in the wind, but holding its own. No smoke was escaping into the yard. Everything flowed properly underground. Then the real test came. At around 9 that night, the storm intensified. The temperature dropped so sharply that the windows frosted over from the inside. The wind screamed under the eaves with a pitch that made the walls tremble. The children woke crying from the cold at the Peterson cabin. The Larsons burned 2 days' worth of wood in a single hour. Frost crept across kitchen tables. Floorboards grew so cold they cracked. Smoke choked families, trying. Neighbors later said this was the moment they realized their beloved stoves, those iron guardians of winter, were not guardians at all. They were fragile, fickle, easily defeated by the kind of storm the prairie delivered once every decade. Inside Callum's home, the fire burned small and calm, but the ground radiated warmth like a sleeping beast. The buried chimney had become a thermal reservoir, releasing heat slowly and evenly. The cabin grew cozy, not hot, but deeply, safely. Hours later, when the fire burned down to embers, the buried flue kept working. It was the strangest sensation Callum had ever felt. A warm floor on a night when the rest of the valley froze solid. At midnight, the storm struck its cruelest blow. The wind shifted suddenly, pushing air straight into the vent stacks of most cabins. Tall chimneys buckled under the onslaught, some cracked from the thermal shock of cold outside and roaring heat inside. Others collapsed entirely. The Larsons' stovepipe broke free and fell, sending sparks across their kitchen. The Harris family woke to snow drifting down their chimney throat. The Petersons huddled under blankets, the stove unable to rise above lukewarm. Callum's system barely noticed the shift. The buried flue, insulated by earth, ignored the wind's violence. The short vent stack at the end resisted downdraft. The intake pipe continued delivering clean oxygen to the firebox. The earth itself stored heat and fed it back into the room. Callum watched the embers glow and felt awe. Not pride, not triumph, but a deep, quiet gratitude. He had trusted the ground, and the ground had answered. But the storm wasn't the only test. At dawn, desperate neighbors arrived at his door. Tom Larson stood shivering, his beard crusted with frost. "We burned almost a cord last night," he said. "Kids are shaking like leaves. How is your—" Callum stepped aside, and the moment Tom entered, he froze. No smoke, no frost on the walls, warmth rising from the very floor. Not a roaring stove, not a blazing fire, just a steady, gentle heat. "What did you do?" Tom whispered. Callum pressed his hand against the floorboards. "I put the chimney where the cold can't bully it." Tom stared at him, not understanding. "So you buried it." Callum nodded, and in that moment the valley's laughter died. Because a buried chimney, something every man mocked, had just defeated a storm that humbled every other stove on the frontier. And soon the question wouldn't be whether Callum's system worked, but whether the entire valley could afford not to copy it. When the storm finally broke, the prairie was unrecognizable. Drifts leaned against cabins like frozen ocean waves. Wagon wheels stuck out of the snow like half-buried crowns. Smoke holes from ruined chimneys poked through white hills where houses had once stood proud. The wind eased into a whisper. The sky brightened, but the damage revealed itself slowly. Families stepped outside with faces swollen from cold and eyes rimmed red from a night of smoke and fear. Across the valley, people looked around in stunned silence, trying to understand how the world had changed so quickly. Then word spread. Callum McKay's cabin had stayed warm, while the rest of the valley froze. At first, people didn't believe it. How could a stove that burned less wood heat a house more? How could a chimney that didn't reach the sky outperform all the proud stacks built by the book? But curiosity is stronger than pride, especially after a night that nearly broke them. By midday, a steady trail of neighbors made their way to Callum's door. They came wrapped in blankets, boots rimmed with frost, hands trembling from the cold. Their stoves had failed. Their chimneys had cracked. Their floors had grown so cold, they formed sheets of ice. Callum greeted each one with quiet calm. He showed them the firebox. Small, simple, but efficient. He showed them the intake pipe that fed clean air directly to the flames. He walked them outside to the low vent stack, rising only a few feet above the snow. And finally, he traced the path of the buried chimney through the earth. To them it looked strange. To Callum it looked inevitable. Neighbors bent down, touched the soil above the flue, and jerked their hands back with surprise. It was warm. In the dead of winter, under a sky that had reached lethal temperatures, the ground above his chimney still held heat. For many of them, that moment was more revelation than lesson. Burying fire had seemed foolish, but burying heat suddenly felt brilliant. One by one, the questions came. Will it work under a bigger cabin? What if the soil is rocky? How deep does it need to be? How long does the heat last? Could we add more than one flue? Callum answered everyone. Not with superiority, not with arrogance, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent years listening to his land, while others listened only to tradition. By spring, the valley transformed. Men with shovels dug trenches behind their cabins. Brick kilns burned day and night to produce new flue sections. Children played in piles of excavated soil, while their parents laid out stone foundations. Some families built short buried channels under existing cabins. Others started fresh, designing houses around the new system entirely. What everyone noticed, what everyone spoke of for years afterward, was how little wood they needed once they adopted the buried chimney. Fires burned slower, coals lasted longer. Warmth seeped into the floor instead of fleeing through the roof. For the first time since settling on that harsh prairie, families slept through winter nights without fear. News spread beyond the valley. Settlements to the east and west sent riders to study the strange design. A newspaper in Omaha wrote a small column about an ingenious chimney that lies humbly beneath the earth. A traveling carpenter copied the system and installed it in 3 cabins near the Platte River. And though no name was officially given to Callum's design, people started calling it the earth stove, the low-draw chimney, McKay's buried flue. Decades later, engineers studying thermal mass systems would marvel that a frontier homesteader working with nothing but clay, stone, and instinct had built something strikingly similar to modern ground-coupled heating. He had done it without equations, without textbooks, without modern tools, just observation, memory, and a refusal to treat winter as an unbeatable enemy. Callum never bragged about what he built. He simply lived with it, season after season, watching his woodpile shrink slower than anyone else's, watching his children grow without the nightly dread of freezing floors. In old age, when asked why he buried his chimney, he always said the same thing. I didn't bury the chimney. I buried the waste. And every winter that followed, families across the prairie warmed their homes the way Callum had warmed his, by trusting the ground to guard the heat. If Callum's story reminds you of the power of forgotten knowledge, of the quiet wisdom hidden in earth, fire, and patience, consider joining us here on Winds of Thought. Together, we keep these stories alive. For those who still believe, ingenuity can come from anyone, anywhere. The prairie eventually softened. The storms changed. But beneath a quiet cabin on a lonely stretch of grassland, the buried chimney still lay where Callum placed it, warm, steady, untouched by the winds that once humbled the valley. And long after those who mocked him were gone, the warmth he'd hidden underground continued to rise.